Let me welcome all of you on behalf of Institute of Chinese Studies, India International Center and School of Language, Literature and Cultural Studies of JNU. Now, this evening, we're organizing this panel discussion to celebrate the 100th anniversary of publication of Lu Xun's seminal short story, A Madman's Journey. Now, I can see from the people present in this audience that one doesn't really have to introduce and explain why we are marking 100 years of publication of one short story, A Madman's Journey, Conger and Ricci. We are doing so because, it was not just a story which was published. It was a milestone event in the literary history of China, indeed in the history of the Chinese nation. A Madman's Diary is sometimes described as the first modern short story of China. It was Lu Xun's first vernacular short story to appear in print. First came out in May 1918 issue of Xin New Youth. It's a story within a story where a friend of the unnamed protagonist learns of his illness and travels to his village only to find that he has recovered and since left take up an assignment. But the brother of the unnamed protagonist hands over to him a diary the sick man had kept, and extracts from the diary constitute the bulk of A Madman's Diary. It chronicles how the protagonist sort of descends into what one may describe as lunacy, when he convinces himself that everyone is out to eat him, and that even his brother was guilty of eating the younger sister, 5-year-old sister who had died earlier, and that now is eyeing him. But clearly it's an allegorical tale which challenges the oppressive nature of Chinese Confucian culture as a man-eating society. And as we were discussing this morning at the conference at JNU, in many ways the madman is the sanest man around. Despite losing his grip on reality, he can see very clearly the true nature of decadent society, feudal society around him. It was such a milestone event which is definitely worthy of celebration 100 years down the road. And today we are fortunate to have a very strong panel of scholars who have worked on Lu Xun and Chinese literature from many countries. But most specifically, I would like to thank Dr. Hemant Adlaka, Professor of Chinese in JNU and Honorary Fellow of Institute of Chinese Studies, who has an abiding passion in Lu Xun and his work. In fact, just now, we have 3 events going. Earlier this morning, an international conference commenced at JNU, which will continue until tomorrow. There's also a photographic exhibition which will be introduced by Hemant through a slideshow in a short while. And then we have this panel discussion. I would also like to thank India International Center in particular for joining us in organizing this event. This event is part of a shared endeavor between the Institute of Chinese Studies and India International Center to project the cultural dimension of India-China relations to try and promote understanding of the Chinese culture, the civilizational heritage of China, in some way not focus excessively on political security, strategic dimension, as is often the case, which also tends to become somewhat, negative at times. As part of this effort, in fact, Shabri is around next year, March next year. We are joining up again three-way partnership involving ICS, IIC, and JNU to organize another international conference to commemorate the 100th anniversary of May 4th movement in China. Now, let me very briefly introduce the panel we have with us. We have Professor Takumasa Seno. Professor Seno is Professor in the Department of Chinese Literature and Linguistics in Waseda University, Tokyo, Japan. He's a very senior academic. He has been engaged in research primarily on modern Chinese literature and culture. We have with us Dr. Roman Shapiro. Dr. Shapiro teaches Chinese literature at the Russian University for Humanities in Moscow. He is also an eminent researcher and a very prolific translator. He has translated the works of many leading Chinese authors, including Jung Chan's best-selling memoir, Wild Swans. We have with us Dr. Emily Mayev-Graf. Emily works at Heidelberg University as assistant professor at the Institute of Chinese Studies. And just earlier this month, on 1st October in fact, she also joined Free University in Berlin. And it's good of her that immediately after joining, she could travel to Delhi. This is her second Lu Xun conference in India. She came earlier in 2012 for a similar conference. Then we have with us Mr. Taku Kurashige. He is a lecturer at the Department of Foreign Languages and Literature at the prestigious Tsinghua University in Beijing. And we have Dr. Raman Sinha from Center of Indian Languages, Jawaharlal Nehru Universities. He has a very wide interest ranging from Sanskrit poetics to Western literary theory, Hindi drama and theatre, and philosophy of literary history. And what is important for us, he has collaborated with Hemant to bring out a Chinese Hindi translation, Lu Xun's prose poetry collection, Wild Grass, which I understand will be published very shortly. And of course, we have Hemant, who is the Sutradhar, of the whole enterprise. Now, as I mentioned earlier, Hemant has an abiding interest in Lu Xun. He has joined with Raman to bring out the Chinese in the translation of Wild Grass. And in fact, he had just also completed translation in Hindi of a Madman's Diary, which I believe will also be published shortly. And presently, he is working on a book entitled The Poetics of Change, Lu Xun's Relevance and Influence on East Asian Modernity. So as you can see, we have a really rich panel to address this issue, and I'll hand over to Hemant, who is the moderator. He will present before you a slideshow on the photographic exhibition, which is currently going on in JNU, and then we'll have a panel discussion. Welcome once again.
Thank you, Director Ashok Kans, for very elaborate and kind introduction to me in particular, and also to the panelists. I'm very conscious and aware of the time we have with us for this booking, so therefore I'll just quickly come to the agenda and begin with I'll just run through this slide because there are 50 or 60 odd slides, and I can't spend much time on each slide. we should have some time for discussion also, not just the slideshow here. And this is the slides of the exhibition which has been on Madman's Diary, put up by School of Arts and Aesthetics in JNU. In particular, one PhD scholar of the school called Ajit. It was all his single-handed efforts. And initially, when we approached them, they told us, if you have pictures, you just pass it on to us, and then we'll convert them into a presentable exhibition. So, as laypersons, we were very, very happy. We downloaded nearly 60-70 photographs from the internet, and then we passed it on to them. And the next day when we asked them, so is it all right? They said actually no, because not even a single one can be printed and put up for the exhibition, because they're very low resolution and we can't print them in bigger size. So then they took the initiative and they formed a team of one professor, Professor Shukla Sawant, and a couple of PhD scholars. They got together and they converted each picture using Photoshop software or other professional softwares into very high resolution pictures. And then the result was, I mean, to me, it was thrilling. I don't know how do you react when you see these slides, but I was totally thrilled to see the final product compared to what we had supplied to them. So very quickly now, I'll just run through it. Well, the curator is not here, but today when we inaugurated the exhibition, he gave us his own narrative of the rationale for putting up the photographs together in the exhibition, and what was the, what drove him to select and put one group of photographs together. But I will not go into that. I selected these photographs because I thought if anyone has even very faint idea of what has been the Chinese political history over the last 100 years, then the way these photographs move from one to the other, they give you a fairly good idea of how Chinese society, especially Chinese politics, as we all know, that if you look at China before the market reforms were introduced, it was all very highly political society in day-to-day life also, which we don't see very much now. So this exhibition actually takes you to the trajectory of the way Chinese politics has evolved and has changed over the last 70 years in particular. So first, of course, is Lu Xun's picture. And most of these pictures are depicting how Madman has been imagined or how Madman has been illustrated in various publications in China, starting from the very first one in 1918, as was mentioned earlier by Director Ashok Kant. And it was written, of course, in 1918 April, and it was published in 1918 May. Since then, it has seen various publication of the story as single story publication, and at the same time as part of the collection of short stories by Lu Xun. And many of the collection of the short stories also have had Madman on the front cover. And the way the cover has been designed, the way the Madman has been portrayed on this cover, that itself is a very telling story of China as well. So this is one such picture. This is the original when it was published in New Youth magazine in 1918. And this original is kept in Beijing Lu Xun Museum in Peking. This is the front cover of the magazine, New Youth magazine. And the previous one was a story. This is written in Chinese, of course, Madman's Diary. This is a very interesting picture. I mean, those of you who can identify the Chinese characters would be very excited to understand these characters. Those who cannot can read the English translation. This is at the peak of cultural revolution in the 1960s, especially in the mid 1960s. And the Chinese vertical line on your left, it's written as translated here roughly by me, smash Liu Shaoqi, Teng Xiaoping, counter-revolutionary clique. And this was used in Madman's Diary. So Madman's Diary was used as a very powerful symbol as well as political slogan during the Cultural Revolution, as one group attacking the other group, etc. Again, this is also from the Cultural Revolution period. Of course, post-Cultural Revolution period, we don't see any publications carrying Madman's pictures showing such either militancy or thank you. This is a very famous picture of Lu Xun happily smoking, and this is again a poster used during Cultural Revolution and then many reprints later, and it basically says learn from or study Lu Xun's revolutionary spirit. This is another of Lu Xun's very famous short story, which will be completing its 100 years in 2 years from now. Lu Xun also is credited with as a pioneer of woodcut prints in China, and he was very heavily influenced by Goya in starting the woodcut prints in China. This is also woodcut prints. How a man feels or how a person feels under the pressure of society. These are all mostly from the collection of woodcut prints as compiled by Chang Yen Nian from different periods, starting from 1980s up to 2010. This is one of the famous landlord family in one of the Lu Xun stories, also in Madman's Diary. You can actually see the contrast of the covers published recently compared to the covers published half century ago or something. And Madman actually is becoming more and more gentleman. These are various books covers published in different periods. This is a French publication of the same New Youth magazine in which it was first published in 1980. This is an e-book. It was published, I think, in 2012. We also tried to download from the internet and show in the exhibition the covers of various publications of Madman's Diary in different languages in the world. This one, for example, how it is in Korean, and the previous one was also in some other. I hope we have something cover of Madman's Diary in Bangla also. This is Gogol and Lu Xun. This is Kindle edition. This is Russian. This is also Russian. This is bilingual edition. This is our curator discovered it from somewhere. This is Gogol's Madman's Diary of a Madman. Some people say that this is actually describing this one of the main protagonists who is always skeptical and scared of. He thinks that everybody is trying to eat him. So. This is the publicity poster of a play in Chinese, a drama on Madman's Diary. This is also a clip from a play in Beijing. This is very interesting. This is as you can see, this is a play on Madman's Diary which was performed in Kathmandu earlier this year by a new theatre group which was founded in Kathmandu. And their first production was Madman's Diary. This is the Gogol's Diary of Madman. These are all, we have seen them individually earlier. This is a collection of the woodcut prints. That's it. Thank you. We will now have a panel discussion as it was introduced in the beginning. We have 5 panelists, and the idea behind this panel discussion was that of course we are having a conference which is going on in JNU and which will conclude tomorrow, but the idea was that since we have experts and scholars from different parts of the world, we should have a non-academic kind of a event where we can, directly interact and exchange with scholars and experts on Lu Xun as well as on Madman's Diary, so that they can tell us about why Lu Xun's writings and Madman's Diary in particular continues to appeal to scholars and to people and to researchers even outside China. Therefore, the theme we gave is whether it is China's words Madman. And it's very awkward but unfortunate that we have panelists coming from Japan, from Russia, from Germany, but we don't have anyone here from China. And actually we were, a Chinese scholar were going to come and join us, but at the last minute she sent a regret message because she had applied for her passport renewal which could not be done in time. So she had to cancel her visit. But instead we have one of the panelists, Taku Kurashige, who has been in Beijing earlier as a PhD student, and now he is teaching there in Tsinghua University. So he's been there in Beijing for more than 6-7 years. So we can, as they say in Chinese, that Tasha Beijing Ranla, that he's a Beijinger now, so we can treat him as a person. And actually the person who was to come from Tsinghua University, when she wrote that she cannot, then she did mention that he will be the flag bearer of Chinese representatives.
Invite them now.
So may I now invite our panelists to please come up and take their seats on stage. Yes, Emily and Professor Takumasa, Taku Kurashige, Shapiro and Raman. Actually, it's a very informally structured panel discussion we have. We had earlier requested the panelists to prepare, if they wish to, a few minutes, whatever they wish to talk about or present to us. And after their initial presentation, then we would have a question and answer session, and you're welcome to ask them questions about Lu Xun or Madman or Chinese literature or Chinese society, etc., etc. So I think we will begin with Professor Takumasa first, and I would request him to talk about the theme and relate it to his larger theme, which he is going to present it tomorrow at the conference also, because he sees the beginning of modern or modernism in Chinese thinking and Chinese literature and Chinese creative works, and therefore in the larger discourse with three diaries. And one diary is Gogol's Diary of a Madman, and second diary is Lu Xun's Madman's Diary, and third is Tuang Xiaotung, another diarist whose famous diary, and he has used that extensively in his paper also, Diary of Grief. These are the three diaries he thinks is the source of the modern in Chinese thinking. So please.
Thank you. Professor Hamad, if I talk about the three diaries, time is not enough to. So I briefly introduce my thought about the Madman's Diary and the birth of Chinese modern literature. Professor Hamad Aduraka asked me a question. The description of the Lu Xun's Madman's Diary, that is the universal problem or the local problem. I think it's a relatively universal. The theory or the philosophy is universal, but it's abstract. The literature is not same with the philosophy or the theory. He describes a local problem, like China, India, Japan. But through the locality, he describes the universal problem. So, for example, in Japan, almost all students in junior high school read a hometown, Lu Xun's short story. A foreign writer's works, every student read his works. It's a very special situation. So almost all Japanese love Lu Xun's works. So it means the one writer's works can become universal. And I recommend, if you read the Lu Xun's works, please appreciate the 2 points. The 1 point, Professor Hamad Aduraka also introduced. Why the Lu Xun's Madman's Diary is called the first work of Chinese modern literature. Someone said it is a sharp thought of Lu Xun, like cannibalism. Or someone said it's an attempt of the vernacular Chinese writing, but I suspect it, because there are many works of the thought sharper than Lu Xun's articles at that time. About the vernacular writing, there are many writings in China at that time. Now, what is the point? Lu Xun's Madman's Diary is called the first work of Chinese modern literature. It is the Lu Xun's Madman's Diaries let the readers feel this story is true and real. This is a very important point. So, Lu Xun's works have very many ideas and techniques let the readers feel the sense of reality and the truth. So, Lu Xun's works is very experimental and challengeable. This is the one point. And the second point, the modernization of literature has occurred every area in the world, like India, China, Japan, Europe. But such a modernization is generally through the many writers' efforts, many years' effort. But Lu Xun, once he writes a Madman's Diary, it's a fully describes modernity of literature. So Lu Xun's works is very special case in the world literature. So if you want to read Lu Xun's works, please appreciate these 2 points. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Takumasa, for being absolutely to the point and brief. I'm now going to request Dr. Roman Shapiro. As this was introduced, during the introduction, Ashok Kant had mentioned about what kind of work he's doing related to Lu Xun and in general on Chinese literature. I'm going to pose a question to you that, of course, your paper is on a different theme. You are trying to look how Lu Xun is reflected or how Lu Xun has influenced another young, very famous Chinese writer, Yu Hua, in Yu Hua's works. But, I mean, why do you think that it is even possible to compare Lu Xun's Madman's Diary with Gogol's Madman's Diary? Because those two at one level belong to completely different periods in history. And we really can't say whether Gogol's diary, other than the title, actually influenced or is reflected in Lu Xun's Madman's Diary. So please elaborate on these 2 points.
Thank you very much, Professor Adlaha. Yes, I think that Lu Xun's Madman is pretty much world's madman, and I would like to show it in a few minutes that I have. I would like to compare Lu Xun's Diary of a Madman to Gogol's story, which is actually, if you read these stories in Russian, usually they have exactly the same title. And Lu Xun stated himself that he was influenced by Gogol, and he himself compared these 2 stories. And I would also like to give some very brief examples of madmen in other traditions and in other literatures. And I would like to show that, of course, Lu Xun's Madman is Chinese. And of course it was something very new and original, and it is very much original now, but it's also rooted in the tradition and it was influenced by other cultures and it influences other cultures at the same time. As we already know, Lu Xun's story is considered the first modern Chinese story written in the vernacular, in vernacular Chinese. Well, the main story is about a young man who's insane, and he thinks he's afraid to be eaten. He thinks that his elder brother wants to eat him. He thinks that everyone around him wants to eat him. And he gives some quotations, real quotations from Chinese tradition, because you can find such quotations that a loyal son should give his meat to his parents, or a loyal servant should give his meat to his lord, to his prince. You really can find these quotations. Then the last sentence of the story is probably there are children who haven't eaten human meat yet, so please save the children. And of course the story was often described as a metaphor. Cannibalism was described as a metaphor, for example, for Confucianism, for tradition which was eating the Chinese society. So what does it have in common with Gogol's story? First of all, well, I think some of you know Gogol. He is considered one of the greatest Russian writers. He was born in 1809 and he died in 1852. He lived in the Russian Empire, and he came from the Ukrainian part of it, so the Ukrainian element is also important in his work. His contemporaries and Soviet critics often said that he is one of the first realist writers, that he's one of the founders of Russian realism in literature, but later critics have seen in him also a romantic sensibility and even surrealism and grotesque, and I think it is well founded because, for example, he has a story where a nose is separated from his owner and walking the streets of St. Petersburg. It's not exactly realistic. Diary of a Madman is one of his most famous stories, Gogol's most famous stories, which was written in 1835, approximately 80 years before Lu Xun wrote his story. It's very popular, and I know that recently, last year, there was an audiobook in Malayalam published in India with this story. So Gogol was one of the favorite writers of Lu Xun. I have some statistics here. During his lifetime, Lu Xun translated 166 foreign works of literature from 21 countries. And out of these 166 works, 44 works were Russian works. So it's 1/4. And I don't have the exact number, but most of these Russian works were by Gogol. So you can see that Gogol was one of his favorite writers. And also Lu Xun wrote 19 papers about Gogol. So Gogol was really important for his work. Lu Xun discovered Gogol in the early 20th century when he and his brother were preparing collections of foreign fiction translated into Chinese for Chinese readers. Lu Xun also mentioned Gogol and mentioned Russian literature in his work, which is called in English A Discourse on the Power of Mara Poetry. By the way, Mara is an Indian term. A discourse on the power of Mara poetry, meaning romantic poetry. And there he says that French literature, English literature, German literature, they're great and they're really influential and witty and deep, etc. But, says he, Russian literature is the dearest to us. because this is the literature of compassion to the small man. The small man meaning someone who is poor, who is isolated from the society, who is lonely. And Lu Xun and some of his contemporaries thought that the situation in China was somehow similar to the situation in Russia, in Tsarist Russia, before the revolution. And so they thought that it's very important to take into account Russian literature. So a few words about Gogol's Madman's Diary. It tells us about a petty civil servant, a poor man who mainly has to copy out some documents in his office and sharpen the quills for his boss. He's in love with the daughter of his department director, and she doesn't even notice that he's in love with her. And the story really has the form of a diary. It has dates, and it shows the slow process of going mad, actually. It begins with the main character just being inaccurate in his job and being criticized for that, like writing something in small letters rather than capitals, or missing some numbers, etc. Then he somehow he imagines that he understands dogs. When dogs bow, he thinks that he understands what they bow about. And he witnesses a conversation between two lapdogs, two small dogs, one of whom belongs to the girl he loves. And so he thinks that he should find the correspondence, the letters these two small dogs write to each other, and he hopes to find out what his girl thinks about him, or whether she has other young suitors, etc. So he finds these dog letters, and they're really funny because they begin, in a very noble way. There are some philosophical or genteel ideas, and then they switch to discussing which kind of bones are better. So it's so they come back to being dogs. And then it goes from bad to worse, because from a dog's letter, the young man finds out that his girl doesn't love him at all, and she has another suitor. He's very much depressed, and he says, "Is he better than I?" No, he just has good clothes, he has a good carriage, he's rich, and that's why. But I'm better than him. And after that, out of his humility comes his pride, because he becomes even more insane, and he imagines he's the king of Spain. He's the king of Spain, but he keeps it secret for a time. He doesn't want to tell it to other people, because he doesn't have his court so far. Okay, and then, because I don't have a lot of time, I will cut it short. Finally, he gets hospitalized. He cuts his coat, his clothes to pieces, because he thinks that this is the costume of the King of Spain. And he's treated really badly at the mental institution. His head is beaten up, he's beaten with a stick, and his head is shaved, and they pour cold water on his head, which was the practice in the 19th century. And then one of the last passages it's completely saying, it's, "Oh mother, my mother, save me. They beat me, they pour cold water on my head, I suffer so much, save me." And we think maybe he's not mad at all. And then we have the last sentence, "Do you know that the Algerian bey has a knob under his nose?" So it's completely out of the context, and we see the seriousness of his condition. And when you read it, especially, I can tell you as a native Russian speaker, when you read it in Russian, you have this very peculiar combination of tragedy and comedy, because it's tragic, isn't it? But when you read it, the way it's written, these letters, dog letters, this style, it's really funny. So you really don't know whether to laugh or to cry. And it is very typical of Gogol, because he said about himself that he laughs through the tears. He laughs through the tears. And I think I've taken a lot of time already, but I should just mention that obviously there are some points in common between Lu Xun's story and Gogol's story, because both characters are officials. The title is actually identical, and the form is the form of a diary, and both men are isolated, they are poor, and of course we can read both of these stories not just as direct descriptions of insanity, but as a metaphor of someone isolated in the society of this small man I was talking about. And I think this makes these stories similar, but of course, obviously, there are differences as well, and I would say that Lu Xun's Madman is much more rational, because he says, I think they're going to eat me because, and he has some reasons, he has some quotations, he has some logic. It's an insane logic, but he has some logic. Whereas if you read the Gogol's story, it's really absurd, it's really inconsistent, and I could give you details, but I just don't have time for that. And I would just like to add that, of course, you find this tradition of insanity as a means of criticizing the society and showing the absurdity of the society in many cultures. And I think in Indian culture, in the Indian culture as well, I know that in India you have this tradition of pravesha, I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing it, spirit possession. And in the Tamil culture you have Shaiva Bhakti poetry, and these poets sometimes behaved as if they were insane. They behaved like holy fools. And we have this holy fool tradition in Russia, by the way. And I know that you have work in modern literature. The author is Fonkim Chodro, and the story is, the work is Komola Kanto, if I'm correct. So it's an opium addict who raves. He speaks something very strange, but actually he criticizes the society and he satirized the society. The last work I would like to mention is Bulgakov's Master and Margarita, where you have two people hospitalized, sent to a mental institution. One is a poet, a bad poet, who after being hospitalized understands that he shouldn't write poetry because he's a bad poet. And the other one is a great writer who is the master, and after he spends some time in the mental institution, he finds the peace of mind and he finds his love. And this novel was also translated into Hindi, I know that. So I think, or at least I try to convince you, to demonstrate to you that Lu Xun's Madman, of course, is a very original and Chinese madman, but at the same time, he's the world's madman. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Roman Shapiro. I'm sure you have definitely succeeded in convincing all of us that if we want to read Lu Xun's Madman's Diary, we should either read it together with Gogol's or before first Gogol's and then Lu Xun's. I also have a question to, or a clarification to ask you for the benefit of people present here, because you mentioned that Lu Xun translated 160 works into Chinese, foreign works into Chinese, coming from 21 countries. But for the benefit of all of us, please clarify whether Lu Xun translated them from Russian, 44 works you said from Russian works, whether they were translated from Japanese into Chinese or from other languages.
Of course, he translated them either from Japanese or from German. Okay. For example, there is Gogol's famous novel, or actually it's a poem. It's prose, but it's called poem by the author, Dead Souls, and it was translated by Lu Xun from Japanese, but he also used the German translation, And Lu Xun did know some Russian. He didn't speak or read Russian perfectly, but he did know some Russian, and there is a paper about his translation of Dead Souls, so he tried to combine. But of course, he couldn't use just the Russian original.
Okay, thank you. And before I move on to the next panelist, I also would like to share with you something very interesting which I overheard in a conversation between Shapiro and Kurashige earlier in the day during the conference, because all four foreign panelists here, they speak excellent Chinese, and Shapiro was narrating to Kurashige that how he happened to start learning Chinese, and there was a Chinese friend or Chinese speaking friend, I'm not very clear, but they had a party kind of thing, and where he had some vodka, and then he was asked to try speak Chinese, and he could speak Chinese having had vodka. So then he realized that if he could do that, then he could very well learn Chinese without having had vodka. So now we move on to Emily Maygraf, and she of course has a very interesting, fascinating topic for conference tomorrow, which if I remember correctly, it is something to do with why are museums afraid of madmen. And but of course we will pose the same question to her also. Located in Germany and having spent several years now researching Chinese literature and also speaking very good Chinese, how does she look at Madman as if world's Madman appearing from looking at it from Germany?
Thank you very much. Yes, I would like to introduce to you these, or answer these questions in the context of my research. I have completed my PhD at Heidelberg University on the topic of Lu Xun on display. So looking at Lu Xun and how he's displayed in museums. And I'm currently working on a book manuscript. So only after the publication I will have the doctoral title. This is connected to the system in Germany, the academic system. But I would like to share for you today why I would recommend to anybody to read Lu Xun's Madman's Diary, and why it was interesting for me and during my research on Lu Xun museums. So what this story, more than any other story, teaches us is to cope with unreliable narrators. So 不可靠的叙述, what we say in Chinese. For it teaches us to be critical, to see the dangers of branding by using categories such as madness, illness, and to question even the most established and seemingly natural categories in everyday life, such as truth, reality, meaning, all these categories. To learn to understand one logic, for example, in this story, the elder brother's logic, and a fundamentally opposing logic, the younger brother's logic, and having to bear the suspense that there is no release. Right? You will have to deal with both of these stories at the same time. You will not get a clear answer which one was the right one. So readers can take away very different conclusions from the story. And sure, there are those that say this is one clear allegory, there's only one way to read the story, and it is an allegory of such and such, which certainly can be argued. However, there are two different ways, of course, one could read the story. The madman was right all along. That could be your conclusion, right? And in your handouts today that you have received in the introductions, this is also the conclusion that you, for now, are given. Right? It says, practically speaking, Lu Xun's madman is actually a rebel, so he's not actually mad. However, within the story, it's not quite that simple. For you are given this story, the diary, by an old friend who hands down this diary, and he describes the madman as being ill. You know, he had a great illness. And this is an illness one can recover from, because the madman himself later is said to have recovered, right? So while he says, save the children, the end of the story remains that he has been cured, and that he continued in society, even having an official post, right? So while you read it, while you are the reader, you will realize you cannot really trust any of these narrators for full. So you realize how every once in a while you have to give in to the control of the different voices that are speaking. And while you're reading, you will imagine, for example, the helplessness of the elder brother when he sees how his younger brother is afraid that he will eat him, right? So the narration of the madman only allows for the elder brother to be malicious, right? To be sly, to actually want to kill him. But in this description between the lines, you also read, of course, this elder brother who wants to tell him, be calm, have some food, have some rest. So this, you have to read in between the lines of the madman as well to get the other story. So in the end, this question comes up again and again because madness is something invisible, right? It's nothing you can actually see, that you can pinpoint. While he does give a lot of examples, he also sometimes uses terms that shows that it could be an interpretation, right? It's how the madman sees the world. So do you, as a reader, see the fangs of the people? They have long teeth. The fangs of the people grinning at him, or do you see the madman seeing the people smiling and having, just large teeth, whatever. So you can tell that it is the description of the madman, of course, who is taking you through the story, and it is up to you to decide what you see, what you read. So do you see the madman gagging on a piece of fish he thinks is human flesh, or do you see him gagging on human flesh? Right? This is, for now, up to you. And there's always room to step outside of the younger brother's narrative. And there is, of course, also room to doubt the elder brother's rationale and to trust the younger brother. With the continuance of the story, you trust the brother more and more, right? The younger brother. And of course, one must not forget, there's always room to also wonder about this good old friend who gave you the diary in the first place, right? Is he trustworthy? He says he never changed anything within the diary, but can you be certain? Isn't it actually, which he claims, that he gives you the diary in order for you to understand this illness, and it is therefore medical research? Possible. Or is this actually a pretext to further hand down the diary in a subversive attempt to keep the younger brother's voice alive in society now that he's recovered, right? So you can see even this narrator could have different motives. You don't know what lies behind this. And so further toward the end, you arguably are more inclined to believe the younger brother, but there is no release. He's not cured, and arguably, having now covered an official office, he has betrayed his own cause, right? So the reason I think this question of reliability and this challenge of dealing with unreliability of this kind is because I've been working with institutions whose narratives are, or we all, too quickly trust, right? And this is a question that all museums have to deal with, not only museums in China, not only museums in India, not only museums in Germany. It is very much inherent to the institution itself. And this is why tomorrow I would like to present this title, Unreliable Narration of Space, a Museum's Discomfort with Madmen. Because they're really not very comfortable with this kind of narration. For, I think it is most interesting to take this story, Madman's Diary, and go into different media. Today we have seen a great presentation with all these different slides and visualizations that take the Madman's Diary to go beyond text, right? And we've even visited the exhibition where we actually saw the printouts, which the curator, I may say, Ajit, has wonderfully designed in the room, right? And of course, every story, even in space, has an author, right? Every museum display you see has a narrator. Somebody's telling you a story. And so we wonder, when we look at these images from the 1980s, the prints, we see these other images of the madman, how he's visualized, breaking the shackles of feudalist society, a man holding a hammer, right, and crushing the chains. That is something, clearly, how somebody is visualizing the madman with a certain understanding of what this madness would be and what sanity would be. And the same thing is true for the museum. So for me, I think it is the most fascinating thing to take a final step and ask why we are so uncomfortable about a madman's narrative in museum space today. So can we allow for unreliability or an unreliable narrator also to enter into the museum world? Right? I found found this very useful in my research because I believe this is something which is a great challenge for all of us, right? Not only in China, in the world, which is my answer, of course, to this question. For the museum's claims over authenticity, over presenting history, over having the master narrative, I think is one thing that the museum will have to grapple with sooner or later, is that one must understand those kind of visitors we want in museums are critical readers, are critical visitors. Right? We want our visitor in museums to know there is an author and to wonder, is he reliable? Right? And this is something I think is fascinating, especially we wonder, can we allow for multiple voices in the display? Can we have two different voices telling two different stories in the display? And can we bear this suspense? Those are the questions I would like to discuss in detail tomorrow, and I hope maybe we can discuss it a little more if you have any questions now here today. Thank you.
Thank you, Emily. I now request Taku Kurashige. I think he is perhaps the best person to talk about the theme today because he's from Japan. He's been living and working in China on Madman's story also. And ever since he has come here, he has been asking us these questions relentlessly. What do Indians think about Lu Xun and what do Indians think about Madman's Diary? So I think now the floor is yours. Please.
Okay, so you just can I ask question then? And what do they think of Lu Xun? Okay, first of all, I like to appreciate giving these great opportunities for organizers, Dr. Hemant and everyone, including Mr. Ambassador, because this is maybe many audience doesn't know this, but maybe this conference, international conference on this specific novel, is maybe the world's the best or only the one international symposium on this novel for centenary. It's kind of weird. It's China, we had a little small one, and not in Japan or other countries. So it's in India. So it is very surprising in a way because India is not a big country for Chinese literature studies. But there are scholars also, and I was very honored to be part of it. And one more thing is that my colleagues, my friends, good friends, some Chinese scholars couldn't make it this time, which is very, very sad. I mean, some bureaucratic process. But I'm happen to coming from Beijing. I'm being there for 10 years now. I have my family there, but I'm Japanese, so I have no right to speak in half of the Chinese people. But my teacher, Dr. Wang Hui's, and his teacher, Mr. Tan Tao, Mr. Tan Tao's teacher is Lu Xun. So I'm somehow related to Lu Xun for my teaching, my mastership. So, and I was not thinking myself of doing Lu Xun scholar in the first place because Lu Xun is too big to deal. Lu Xun is too big to deal. He is a very difficult, complicated, big historical figure in the literature, not only literature, but Chinese history, maybe world history. And, but eventually, I was kind of ended up doing Lu Xun because I couldn't avoid Lu Xun for doing this specific time of history in the East Asia in the 1930s and 20s and 40s. It's very bad time of errors. And my country, Japan, invaded China, and before that, there was a very different process of it. So I'm also talking with Dr. Hemant and the Indian friends how Indian people look into Lu Xun. This is, personally, it's a very interesting topic. Maybe it's also a very important topic in the world literature history. But the sad thing is that it really didn't happen until recently. Part of the reason is that there was not much direct connection between China and India at the time. There was one exception, that Mr. Tagore came to in China for 1920s, and there was some communication between some Chinese intellectuals and the Indian part, but it was not a great successful in a way in terms of the Lu Xun's perspective. And I know this topic was even discussed before in this conference, so I don't mention it. But my also topic on this Madmans Diary is related to this subject because it's the subject of the intellectuals. Madman himself is an intellectual. He's a Lu Xun. He reads book. He can read it. He's from traditional, intellectual family, and he became mad. And this, how we define mad is a big issue anyway. But the one thing that I think it's very appropriate to talk in India because Asian civilizations has a lot of very rich culture of the linguistic history, starting Latin and the Chinese characters, and of course in the Hindu, Sanskrit, and Persian, and everything. Having strong background of civilization, you have a very strong background of the linguistic, very privileged language culture. Then, when you modernize it, there is an old intellectuals turning into the new intellectuals, and Lu Xun was in this part of it. But the interesting thing is that Lu Xun was critical of both, of old and new intellectuals. It's kind of, we talk about old intellectuals become modernized, they become more successful. It's a good story, and we still buy this. But Lu Xun was in a very interesting way is that literary man, those man with words, it's not something it can be really not the perfect people, can be maybe doubtful, especially in the eyes of the ordinary people, the ordinary citizens who are, who cannot read. So the power of writings and language, Lu Xun was very suspicious, and he's from China, so he knows this, a very rich culture of Chinese writing history. And on this story, the Madmans Diary, there's one phrase that he is reading the book. He doesn't specify what kind of a book, but he's reading a book, and he sees the words, 仁义道德, virtue and moral. It's all written in virtue and moral. It's Confucius ethics, and it's written all over that. But he was looking overnight, and he started seeing the words in the lines. It's a children that eat people, eat humans. So this is how that he kind of turned into became mad or being awakening to the nature of the Chinese society. And this is, I think, it's very interesting place to pay attention to it because Ren Dao is written in the classical Chinese writing, but the children, this is a vernacular Chinese. And what is point of this cannibalism in the Chinese, novel anyway? But I don't think it's not really talking about real cannibalism. It is using the metaphor of cannibalism to be suspecting of these classical intellectual societies or kind of exploiting people, maybe not biological, but more socio-economical way. So, for the reason I bring this subject is that as there are many audience also university students, maybe JMU the best, academic institute in India, and I'm also Chin for a very nice place, and there are some great scholars also. But one thing is that we sometimes miss it. As intellectuals, our status is kind of special. And it's kind of very easy to take granted, because we get paid well, and if you study well, of course, writing a dissertation is very difficult, very challenging, it's a very painful process. But we get very privileged status by doing this, and we can resolve lots of issues by doing that. But Lu Xun was kind of always not very supportive of this, this process of being successful by doing this kind of intellectual success story. He was always suspicious of these successful intellectuals and scholars and writers talking beautiful story, laying down democracy, science, or anything, any beautiful values. He was, do you really mean that? Lu Xun was always skeptical of these kind of words. It's not words itself. Laying down moral virtue is a great thing. Democracy is great. But who is saying this? Who is saying this, and who does they really mean it? So I don't know. Lu Xun is very powerful by he criticized many other intellectuals. He fought a lot, but also he was very warm person. I hope that you can understand Lu Xun's these two different sides together. He was very aggressive, angry guy, scary guy, but also he was very warm person. There's one story I like to share with you at the end of my talk is that there's one young man when he came to buy his book directly visited Lu Xun's house, and he gave to Lu Xun, this kind of coins to Lu Xun's, and Lu Xun gave him the book. And there in the coin, it's still warm. It got still heat temperature of this young man. So Lu Xun just poured his coins. He just thought that he should never forget this. he's paying these coins, this money is he earned by himself, the young guy. It's not cheap book, but he's written something, and he must be responsible for his saying. And this young man is buying this, and he gonna be maybe trusting this. So as intellectuals, Lu Xun was extremely responsible, and also he was very aggressive for some others, but not for people. So this attitude is very special, and isn't after century, I think it's still lots we can learn from it. And I don't know, and it's just a great thing that India, also China, is now having more communication in terms of the literature, like French Hand, another great Indian writer talking about people in India, and the Lu Xun. There's a more dialogue and communication between India and China. It's also a great thing, and I'd like to see in the future there's a more great communication. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Taku Kurashiki. In fact, a very interesting thing he mentioned, and it feels nice. We also feel nice if somebody mentions to us that even in China they haven't had yet an international conference on Madman's Diary, and we are holding it here. So thank you very much. And I suddenly remember that I can answer your question that what do Indians think about Lu Xun? And that is also perhaps a first in the world, my answer, that that yesterday or day before, I actually saw a film on Netflix, a Bengali film, which was released last year. And in one of the sequences in the film, is a young couple, a woman and her partner, and it's a very intense scene, and they have some argument with each other, and there is some tension in the air, and suddenly the woman tells her partner that, come on, now you are talking like Lu Xun. So I think that's also a first. No commercial film anywhere perhaps has given this kind of a dialogue. So with that, I move on to our last panelist today, Dr. Raman Sinha. Maybe he would throw some more light on what Indians think about Lu Xun, but definitely I remember one of our own fraternal family member, Professor Patricia Roy, who has been working on this theme for decades now. In fact, she recently mentioned that very close parallel can be seen in Lu Xun's Madman's Diary or even AQ with Manto's Tovateksing. So, Raman.
Madman's Diary can be approached from several angles. Here, what was the main question to whether Madman is a world's madman or it is culturally specific? It depends upon how you read it. Basically, if you read it literally, then it is culturally specific. Cannibalism in China was rampant, and what we heard from the K.K. Ray's book, Cannibalism in China, that it was there. And cannibalism can be approached in Lu Xun's story in very literal sense. Okay. But if we read it as an allegory metaphorically, then it is worldwide, its implications. And when we know from the biographical details of Lu Xun, he was very much aware of Freud's psychoanalysis. And when he was in Japan, he read Freud. And in fact, he was the first person in China to know about the Freud's theory. And Freud has approached his case histories like Ratman and so many Wolfman, Dora, Little Hans, and Dr. Schreber from one German doctor. He has written one autobiography, and according to that autobiography, Freud has analyzed his case also. And I found this Madman's Diary, very much similar to what Freud has produced and analyzed Dr. Schreber's history. Okay, so if we take it, in metaphorically, and how the approach and the method of the psychoanalysis this man has applied, then we reach in a different conclusion. And first of all, what very much interesting is that the person who is the narrator, he writes in classical Chinese, but diary is in vernacular or Waihua. So it is also very significant the diary is being presented by the narrator, who himself writes in classical Chinese, and the diary itself is in vernacular. So it is a very obvious and subtle, way to demarcate between what is being said and what is his interpretation. And first of all, this diary is not being presented in toto, rather it is edited version. So we must think what he is presenting is not the full truth. He is presenting an edited version. And editing is always, a kind of manipulation. Editing is always manipulation. It is not, you are not free to reach any conclusion on your own. Rather, you have to see it through his eyes. So if we approach this, how Freud has approached the Dr. Schreber's case, and what Lu Xun has produced in the same manner, and analyzing the same method. Even Freud discusses in the preface of this Schreber's case, see, there are two ways how to approach the case. First is, if we delusion utterances of a patient, if we take into note of this thing, we reach into different things. We reach different conclusions. Lu Xun has approached this method, only the delusional utterances of the patient, in this case the madman, he has taken some edited version, how he reached to a conclusion that he is mad. But the madness itself was not defined in the text itself, rather he just produced in a way that suits his case. So there are two versions. One version is the narrator who presented it, and other what diary itself says. So my argument would be whether it is world's madman or whether it is cultural China's madman, I will say if you will see from the literal point of view the cannibalism in China, then it is literal, and if we approach it through the psychoanalytical point of view, then it is world's madman.
Thank you, Dr. Raman. Very quickly to wind up the panelists' views, when he mentioned about how the diary was edited, I suddenly remembered that it has been mentioned earlier by many speakers today in the conference also and here also. And in China, many Chinese critics and commentators, they make it a point to mention, to find a context to mention that this story is written in 4,700 characters. Because Chinese write in character this thing. So 4,700 might sound to us, 4,700, but by Chinese standard, it's a very, very short written piece. And in China, normally authors or writers are given the remunerations for their writings by the total number of characters they write. So from Chinese point of view, 4,700 characters would have earned very little money to Lu Xun, right? So anyway, I now open the floor for question answer session, although we are not actually left with much time, but still we will be very happy to take questions. Yes, please identify yourself and be brief. Can we have the...
Thank you. I'm Sanjeev Srivastava. I am a researcher on foreign policy issues, but the topic was so interesting that I could not stop myself coming here. And thanks to organizers for organizing this conference. My question is, obviously, Lu Xun Madman is world's madman. Tapu Kolash Shige, he asking about what Indians are thinking. In my personal view, I am completely in agreement with most of you that he is the world's madman. Obviously, he is seeing some reality which the society and system cannot see it, and if sometimes they see it also, they cannot express it. And Lu Xun is a kind of person who can express the reality, what he is seeing about the system or about the society, the harsh reality. So that's where Lu Xun differentiates himself from the other people in the society, and society starts calling him a madman. So in that way, I look at Lu Xun, and I think it's a great work, and obviously very nice to see that it's being celebrated in India, not in China, not in Japan, not in Russia, but in India. So it is but relevant for the entire world, I believe. My question to the panel would be that do you think that this problem, what Lu Xun is indicating at, is intrinsic part of our human nature, or it is, what is the, is it part of the human nature? Because you are researching on the Lu Xun. So I would like to know whether he said anything that whether it is intrinsic in the human nature, or if it is intrinsic in human nature, if this is a problem, then how can it be resolved? That's my question. Thank you. What people are calling him mad, but he is very convinced that that is the real.
Thank you, sir. This is very important question. What is Lu Xun indicating in the Madman's Diary? Is it human nature or something else? I think there is a huge change in Lu Xun's pieces in the later and after. But this is his first, well, it's not real first, but we said it's first his novel, short novel. And it's maybe origin of Lu Xun's literature. And human nature, like you said, I think this is very closely related to Madman's Diary. I personally think that. But also, we cannot forget another side of it. This is the human nature side, because Lu Xun, Madman was kind of awakening to, his own, like nature of the maybe his world or his society. But eventually he gave up. Actually, he fails, because in the introduction we know that his madness is cured and he goes back to work. So he's not madman anymore in the end of the story. So this is how we understand this. So human nature was maybe part of a problem for madmen or other peoples, but eventually that becomes not problem, it's actually resolved, because madman is not mad anymore. So this is how we understand this. He raised the problem, maybe that's something to do with human nature, maybe nature, people eating people, cannibalism. The cannibalism, how we look at it, because cannibalism is so rare to happen. It's somewhere we do it, but it's very specific thing. But maybe cannibalism or eating people in a socioeconomic way, what you call exploitation or something like that, it's a very common thing to happen everywhere, anytime. So how we see it, this part of this human nature itself, but also it's maybe the outside of human nature, the society. The society with the pressure eventually pushes Madman to be insane to sane. He gave up because it's too difficult to be mad in the real world. You become to be maybe sane maybe it's better to be sane in the insane world to protect yourself, because too much idealism can be harmful sometimes. So people actually, put up their dream and go back to work, right? To wear the suits. So I think this is maybe the way of the something to do with human nature and outside of society. It sounds like a very contemporary subject, but I think it's already in this novel too. That's my answer.
Thank you, Taku. Tilak? Yeah.
Hi, I'm Tilak. I work for the BBC. My question is that can the relation of Lu Xun with communism and Communist Party in China, how do you see it? And can there be a madman in China today? And particularly, Germany has a special relationship in getting Liu Xiaobo's wife recently out of the country, out of China. So maybe I think you can say a particular, a special, different perspective from your point as well.
Thank you for your question. I think, it's hard for me to speak as a German. I think I will simply speak as a scholar of Chinese literature. And of course, the question that you're posing is how is Lu Xun, I guess, connected to the Communist Party, right? And this is, of course, a question that has been debated in detail. In many, many ways. In my case, I have, of course, worked on museums, on official displays, and museums are, in China, to the most regard, they are state organizations, right? So very much, of course, as in all countries, the state museum will present a certain official narrative of the story of the writer, and also of the interpretation of the literature. Right? So this is certainly common, and in the past, especially in the past, there was a very strong, let's say, urge to connect Lu Xun to the party in a positive way, right? Be it through emphasizing Mao Zedong's praise of Lu Xun, be it by trying to make it clear that Lu Xun also was a supporter of the Communist Party, which was not quite as easy as the other way around. So in that case, many ways were found to emphasize this. If you look even at all the different posters we've seen, for example, today, some of them actually from the times were presenting Lu Xun as a supporter of the Communist Party or the supporter of communism more generally, right, was actually the goal of every visualization, of most of the visualizations. So this was, of course, an attempt that was, or it was often attempted, it was often achieved with these forms of displays and visualizations. Now, if you ask me, of course, about the current situation and about madmen in society, I think this is something absolutely relevant in all societies. I don't think that, the question of course, this always comes up and up again, is there Lu Xun in China today? And I am sure that it is this willingness of accepting different voices in a framework that allows you to continue dialogue and not to only accept one interpretation of one story is essential to that. So this is something, that comes in the Madman's Diary through the unreliable narrator, I believe, as well. And is always, of course, important in, I would argue, in museum space. And I think this would be a step forward.
Thank you, Emily. Just to add, because the question you asked is not very easy to answer in such a short time. Yeah. And it's two parts of the question, actually, whether you are trying to understand what Lu Xun thought of communism, or what was the relationship or equation between Lu Xun and the Chinese Communist Party. And so I just mentioned two things which might throw some light to understand actually what was going on at that time. One is that Mao actually had called Lu Xun a Bolshevik. This is not very much known outside Chinese literature, not in English or outside China much, but Mao had called Lu Xun a Bolshevik, especially during a period when Lu Xun was under attack by the KMT and all that, and then some of the revolutionaries, along with Communist Party left group writers, they wanted to save Lu Xun, rescue Lu Xun rather from the attack, and then some suggested that Lu Xun should be taken to the liberated areas and asked to give education to writers and other Communist Party members in the liberated areas. And then Mao said, no, let Lu Xun, we will of course try to rescue Lu Xun, but let Lu Xun stay independent and let Lu Xun continue what he is writing. And let us continue to look at him as a Bolshevik. That was one. And then Lu Xun himself, before his death, 1.5 years before his death, he had written in a letter to a friend that that people have misunderstood what I said about RQ, the other famous story of RQ, in which RQ is saying something about revolution. And Lu Xun said that people or readers had misunderstood. They thought that RQ is talking about revolution of 1911, whereas what I had meant by putting through RQ, what I had meant was what was going to come 2-3 decades ahead of now. So that's an indication of what was Lu Xun thinking about Communist Party, or Lu Xun also had written at one place somewhere that if eventually the communists come to power, then I will run away, because otherwise I might be killed. We have one more last question from this gentleman here. Please identify yourself.
Thank you, Combe Carpentier from France, but living here. I had a question which had to do with the way in which you envision Lu Xun's perspective on madness, because in my view there are two traditions. One is the tradition of morosophy, The Wisdom of Madness, which you find in Erasmus, which essentially says society is mad, but it cannot but be mad, and the only way to get out is to be essentially mad yourself in the eyes of others, but in fact a wise man, which is also the image of the Taoist or the Zen Buddhist sage. But then the other vision is that society is truly mad and you have to reform it. And therefore those who appear mad are in fact the reformers. Do you think Lu Xun wanted really to reform society? Or do you think he really thought society was intrinsically mad and therefore he positioned himself basically as somebody who is not really willing to reform anything, but he's just showing a mirror of society's madness? Thanks.
What I think is, since you must be knowing the Madness and Civilization, the book, where he quoted his preface, Foucault, that two quotations he has given. First quotation is Pascal, where he says that man is essentially man or mad. And to counter that madness, we require other kind of madness, other form of madness rather. So the other form of madness, what is that other form of madness? So if we see what we say rationality is other kind of madness in that sense. So both are essentially mad in that way. So the thing is from where you are looking, madness from which part? From the narrator's point of view in Lu Xun, or from the person who is mad, or you are saying he is insane and now he is cured. So cured from the madness and got another form of madness. Okay. So I think it could be visualized in this way.
You would like to add to this quickly? Yeah.
What time this panel is finished?
As soon as you finish.
Okay. I'll give him 5 minutes. Okay. Thank you for your questions. But I think the revolution, the metaphor of the criticism, of the human nature, is all of this thing is the reader's feeling. The Lu Xun's Madman's Diary, the text is no description about this. So the problem is how the Lu Xun let the readers feel such a sense. This is a modern. This is the most important problem of modern literature. This is modern literature. Firstly, Mr. Hamilton Aduraga, let me say, is how the Lu Xun realized the method of modern literature. This is the problem. You have a problem about the humanity, or the metaphor, or the revolution. All of these things is Lu Xun let the readers feel. Now, how Lu Xun let the readers feel such a thing? Lu Xun's Madman Diary is consisted in two parts: preface and the diary, Madman's Diary. Preface is describes progress of getting a diary. It's written by complete classical Chinese. It's imitating the note novel in Ming Dynasty. The Ming Dynasty note novel, this description is imitated. Historical episode, Shi Zhuang. It emphasizes it's a fact that real occurred. And the diary is written by the perfectly classical Chinese, vernacular Chinese. So the readers feel it, feel the voice of the madman is the real voice, true voice of the madman's voice. So readers can look it as a clinical case. This is the structure of the text of Madman's Diary, Madman Diaries. And next, the other works by Joshua Chuen, A Diary of Grief, it is published in 1917. It's the same story about a diary. Firstly, it introduced the progress of getting a diary. A girl is sad in the balcony in the midnight, about the trouble her life, sad in the balcony, and she dropped the diary. And the next morning, a vegetable seller picked it up and sold it to a literati. The literati is a friend of Joshua Chuen. So he recommended Joshua Chuen write about the diary. So the text, the structure of the text is very similar to Lu Xun's Madman Diaries, but there's a contradiction. Why the Joshua Chuen knows the side of this girl? It's a hypothetical fiction. About it, Lu Xun's Madman Diaries has no contradiction. So Lu Xun's Madman Diaries let the readers feel it is a real. This is a point of important point of Lu Xun's Madman Diary, his works. And the diary is consisted of two parts. It's a feeling of outside world and the Madman's confession. It's more and more getting strong. And the madman said he is normal, and the people around them he is abnormal, cannibal. Now readers feel the madman is abnormal. The people around them is normal. The more he said, the readers more feel that. Oh. And then the readers is standing by the people around. But in the last, Madman reflects. He is probably have eaten the man. Oh. Now, who is the normal? Who is abnormal? The madman is reflective. The people around them is not reflective. Now, who is normal? Who is abnormal? This line is not clear. So such a description, use such a description, Lu Xun let readers feel this is a real. So we can feel about the metaphor, humanities, and liberation, very many things. Compared with the Gogol's Madman Diary, Gogol's Madman Diaries only consists of the Madman Diary. It's more real than Lu Xun's Madman Diaries, as the diary and Madman writes. But it's not let the readers feel it is a diary. It is connecting with the reader's heart. It is only the diary. If the madman writes a diary, it's like this. It's not my problem. It's not your problem. But Lu Xun diaries let the readers feel this is your problem. So I said, your problem. This is I think this is a key point of Madman's Diaries. Lu Xun Madman's Diaries.
Okay, I think you want to say something?
Maybe just to this question, just
very quickly.
Very quickly.
Yeah.
I think because you asked, is Lu Xun not then simply leaving everybody in this sane world that is actually happens, right? I think maybe because in my presentation it seemed that I was very much going for the argument that everything remains up to the reader, which is true. I would argue to a point, but one can hardly unknown that what one has once learned, and knowing that there is a cured madman out there in the streets of China, in the streets of Germany, in the streets of India, walking around, is maybe one of the points that makes us realize that we cannot accept that, right? So maybe the cured madman is maybe the strongest image, maybe even the more appalling function this story has than Save the Children at the end, right? Even though it's a scary image, the cured madman. But on the other hand, it is one that will keep us working and improving.
Thank you. Thank you, Emily. I'm sorry, I know everybody has lots of things to say, to ask, but I think the best I can say is that at least we don't think we are mad because we care for time. So, thank you so much. And I once again thank the ICS, the IIC, and especially I thank all our students who have come all the way from JNU to come and participate in this.